All right, so welcome back for another lovely evening here in class, talking about the New Testament. So we've been kind of dwindling our focus more and more on the subject that we're about to get to. We started with looking overall at what is Revelation, why is it we talk or look into this, what is so important about all of this, talking then about the scriptures overall, talking about even the world into which this exists, into which this happened. So now we're going to begin to look more clearly into the texts themselves. Now, the major part of this class will be spent on the first 4 books of the New Testament. Books that are known in English as Gospels. But what are these Gospels about? What is so important about all of these things? We can get a hint of that and why we even call them Gospels. Why we even choose to use that word. Gospel is a degradation of Old English Godspell, which was itself for the English speakers trying to translate the Latin word used to describe all these, evangelium, which itself is a translation or a transliteration of a Greek word, euangelion, not evangelion. Euangelion. No mechas here. No robots. Nice. What does this ultimately mean? Because basically all these other words are translating euangelion. Euangelion, at its root meaning, means good news. But not just good news in the sense of perhaps the feel-good stories we may see on the nightly news. No, it is news that is so important, so great, so immense, that it needs to be spread to everyone as much, as urgently as possible. The root meaning of you, which means good, angelion, meaning a message or news or announcement. This is not something that you just pass along. Oh, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? No, it is so important that there is an urgency, there is a need to announce this euangelion, whatever it is. So the Latins basically made it into their own language, evangelium. The Old English translated it, Godspell, God in this sense isn't good. And it corrupts ultimately into Gospels. So ultimately the Gospels are good news. This is why many Christians talk about saying it's the good news. It's not just, it's this nice phrase that sounds good. That's literally what the word means.
Mr. Sharp.
Yes.
This is Anton Johnson. I just wanted to let you know I got out of football practice late, so I'm just now joining the Zoom.
All right. No problem. I appreciate your honesty. Decent news to hear. Now, the euangelium or the evangelium had a slightly different meaning in non-Christian Greek times and non-Christian Roman times. For the Greeks, a euangelion was normally victory, in particular, military victory. How many of you ever heard the story why we call it a marathon? One of you? All right. Some people, some more, some less.
Well,
Why is it that a marathon is run that certain distance? The story goes, the Athenians, members of a Greek city-state, were fighting another Greek city-state that outnumbered them. They achieved military victory in the place known as Marathon. The news was so tremendous, so important, they sent a runner to run immediately to Athens with the news of victory. The story goes, this runner traversed the course, what's it, like 26 miles? Something like 26 and a half miles, more or less, at a supposedly record time, or, as fast as possible. Runs into the town square, screams out the word Nike, which was not an advertisement, but the Greek word for victory. He screams, Nike, we have won, and supposedly collapses. Some stories say he died, some say he has to recover for a little bit. That's how important of news that was. That is something that is euangelion. Good, immense, great. It needs to be announced and spread. The Romans would take this concept, translating it into their own. Greeks prefer U, Latins prefer V, whatever. The Romans more often saw an evangelium as something related to the emperor. So either the birth of a successor, the firstborn son of the emperor, or the ascension of a new emperor. That news is so important, it needs to be spread to every corner of the empire. Everyone must know that there is a new emperor, whether an emperor to be, or one who now fully assumes the reign of Caesar, with supposedly the divine protection over him, the laurels of office. So the Christians, in beginning to write and talk about Jesus, take this word to themselves and utilize it in proclaiming all that Jesus did and taught. Why? Because they saw this as euangelion, as evangelium. They saw this as good news, news that everyone needs to hear. News of the true victory over the enemies of humanity. News of the true ascension of not an emperor, but a king over all kings. Of a kingdom that all are called to enter into and partake in. A good definition, a good Christian understanding of this gospel, of what is this gospel and why it's so important, comes to us within the New Testament itself. The letter to the Romans, the very beginning. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. Paul, one of the proclaimers of this gospel, writing to a Christian community in the imperial city of Rome, the most important city in the world, and at least the Western world.
Hey, Professor
Paul,
Straub.
a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God.
Professor Straub.
Oh, sorry. Yes?
Can you move your screen up? I couldn't see what you wrote up top on.
I see that. I wrote Romans. No. See there? Romans 1, 1 through 6 is what I wrote.
Okay. Thank you.
Better? It's a little bit better. Romans 1, 1 through 6. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and designated Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all the nations, including yourselves who are called to belong to Christ Jesus. So, the gospel concerning this one who is said to descend from the heavens, to be related to God in some way, who walked, talked, preachings, teachings, miracles, died, and above all, rose from the dead. And who through that, in some way, has brought about, as Paul writes, the obedience of faith. Now, obviously, we are looking at texts. We're looking at written texts and looking at all of this. However, the gospel was not originally a written text. As we talked about in looking at how revelation and how tradition works, we saw that at first it has to happen, and then it has to pass at least by word of mouth. As we will see in looking at the Acts of the Apostles, we will see how the first disciples of Jesus, his leaders, the leaders of his community, first went out and began preaching about this. In the streets, in the synagogues, among people. It is only later that they began to write these texts. So we don't call them gospels because of what they are recalling for us. We call them gospels because they contain the gospel, the good news, the evangelion that is meant to be spread, to be announced, to be shared. Why? We want everyone to share in our good news. Something that's very great, very wonderful, we announce it to everyone. In one sense, we have far bigger capacity to do that, don't we? Social media, post things up. I passed my class today. I've graduated. I've got a job. We can share so much more, in some ways, to a wider audience. It's the same with everything concerning the subject of the Gospels. And that is this Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels are not necessarily concerned with history, though they do report history. They are concerned with the announcement about this person, about Jesus. So they reveal it in everything that needs to be revealed. Now, we need, in one sense, to understand what the Gospels are in the format in which they are written, the genre in other words. Why? We understand something about a text if we understand its genre, the general work or type of work that it is, right? Think about it with media, film or TV. We appreciate different genres differently. We appreciate dramas different than we do comedies, different than we do tragedies, different than we do documentaries. We don't watch every film the exact same way or with the exact same expectations. It's the same in reading the Bible and reading the New Testament. We need to understand the genre of what we are reading in order to dive more deeply or to hone our expectations of what the text is going to reveal to us. The genre with the Gospels is not, in one sense, necessarily as clear-cut or exact as we may want it to be. Most scholars put it in the form of Greco-Roman biographies. Now, what do we think of when we hear the word biography? What are we expecting? If we have a book in front of us, the biography of Winston Churchill, or Napoleon, or Harriet Tubman, what do we expect out of a biography? That's one thing.
A summary of the person's life.
A summary of the person's life, yes?
Someone's outside account of that person's life.
Usually we would like, an outside account. Others?
Their achievements or what they did in life.
What's that?
Their achievements or what they did in life.
Their achievements, what they did, what they accomplished, what they failed at, perhaps. Others? Perhaps if we have access to it, their own words. If they wrote a lot, or if they were interviewed much, or if they left things like journals behind. That's what we come to expect. We see it in many ways in our current context, our modern context. We see biographies more as a stringing together of facts, perhaps into a decent narrative, but more often than not, just as much as possible, presenting us just the facts, man. Just the facts. That's all you need, right? Just the facts. This is not how biographies were written in these times. In the times of the Greeks and the Latins, the Romans, biographies were not per se mere factual accounts. Not to say they're made up. I don't mean that. That wasn't their primary goal in writing them. He wasn't to go, well, glorious Julius Caesar was born in so-and-so year, was raised in this family, did this and that. No, that wasn't their focus. Their focus was in displays of character. Not factual accounts, but displays of character. Obviously, with the limited ability of writing, only so many could write, only so many could even read. And it was a lot of work in those first few centuries, around the time of the New Testament. It was so much work to write something down, to spread it, to disseminate it. So it's not writing about any any Josephus Schmoefus in the Roman Empire. No, they wrote about people of immense character. So more often than not, these biographies focused on a single individual. Not to say that they didn't have others in there, but you could think of it as, the camera continually focusing on that one individual. Other people may come into the picture, but the camera remains focused on that one person. That's what these biographies start with, that focus on this individual. Why this individual? Because they are a person of immense, deep, and imitatable character. This is someone that you should emulate, was the thought. A great figure to emulate, to be like in one's own way. These biographies are broadly chronological, but at times they may arrange events in a thematic way. So it's not that they're saying this event happened and this event that happened and this event happened. They may arrange similar events or events that might have some correspondence together so that you may pick up a theme. You may want to exemplify Caesar's magnanimity towards his conquered foes. So instead of writing about how Julius Caesar crossed the English Channel and marched up there, you might talk about how he dealt with the surrender of many of the Angles and the tribes on the British Isles, versus how he dealt with the surrender of many of the Gallic peoples. It's not a straight chronological account. It is more thematic, exemplifying the various virtues that this character, this individual, practices. Their fortitude, their justice, their magnanimity, their intellectual prowess. You may arrange it more in those types of things. And more often than not in these biographies, one period of life dominates. Why? Because for most people, they weren't as concerned with how they got where they are, per se. They want to see how it comes to fruition. So they won't focus on the education. You may just have a little bit of he was educated by so-and-so. Served so-and-so here. Now here's where the real action begins. Right? Most of what we know about Julius Caesar, that comes from himself, are about his journeys among the Gallic peoples, his various wars that he waged. Not much of what happened before that, how he got there, how he rose among the military ranks. So it is in this way, it is in this style, this genre, that these Gospels are composed. Their focus is on Jesus. Their focus is on this Jesus of Nazareth. They focus mostly on his adult life. We will see very little of his life before he is a grown man, beginning to start his public ministry. And what we see is not necessarily happening chronologically. More often than not, arranged thematically. Teachings that Jesus does, miracles that he does, events that happen.
Are there any books that depicted his life before he was an adult?
None that are considered truthful. And
Okay.
that leads to the next item in looking at the Gospels. We have in the New Testament 4 Gospels. There are 4 different books that we say are Gospels, announcing about the one Gospel. In their biblical order, this is probably a review for many of you: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, these are not the only texts that claim to be Gospels. These are not the only books or texts that are written concerning Jesus. We sometimes may think, well, it was just these. No, there were multiple groups writing soon after or long after the life of Jesus concerning what he did and he said. There are nearly 100 Gospels from that time, or 100 texts that claim to be Gospels. And one of the most famous ones in more recent times is called the Gospel of Thomas. Most serious scholars date it to about the late 2nd or early 3rd century, so around the year 150, maybe to 225, when it was written. Now remember, we normally say the life of Jesus is from about 1 BC to AD 33.
Did you say it was 150 to 255 AD?
Yes, the AD for the dating of Thomas.
Thank you.
After Jesus. So well over 100 years after the end of Jesus' life on earth. This one gets a lot of circulation. It got a lot in the 90s because of a movie that said, this was the true gospel, almost the pre-BuzzFeed the gospel the church doesn't want you to know. The 5th chapter will blow your mind. This was far before BuzzFeed, but it's almost like that, as silly of a thing like that. Movie called Stigmata, about a woman who is not a practicing Christian, who supposedly begins receiving the miraculous wounds similar to Christ. Supposedly it's happening from this dead priest trying to get people to read this gospel that the Vatican's trying to keep us away from. No, that's not the case at all. Gospel of Thomas has been known since its existence. But it's rejected as not belonging in the canon. We talked about the canon of Scripture. It's not considered a canonical gospel. Why? Because ultimately his message is inconsistent with what has been proclaimed. Now, one reason people focus on the Gospel of Thomas is because it supposedly gives a greater emphasis to Mary Magdalene. This is supposedly a text that says, well, Mary Magdalene is the wife of Jesus. She got a truer gospel, whereas the other ones tried to cover it up, tried to hide her influence and whatnot. It also says in there that Jesus revealed to Thomas, one of the apostles, one of the leaders, supposedly in this text, that Mary Magdalene would become a man. That Jesus would work his wonders and make Mary Magdalene a man. Rather odd statement, in my opinion. So why is it that we only have these 4 Gospels? Why are these 4 in there and no others?
Weren't
What
those some of his
to
main
all of
results?
that? There are
Where's that?
certain criteria that were used in the judgment of all of this for those specific Gospels. The first is that they have apostolic origin. The a group of 12 followers of Jesus are known as the apostles. Because, as we will read in the text, they are set aside and sent out. Apostolos means one who is sent out. So you could say, in a certain sense, almost like an ambassador or a nuncio. One who is sent out with a message or something to do. So to say something is of apostolic origin is to say it comes directly from these apostles, or someone who worked very closely with those apostles. Like was alive when the apostles was alive, heard and maybe even wrote it themselves on command of the apostles. 2 of the 4 texts are said to be written by apostles themselves. Matthew and John, the first and the last. Matthew and John are both apostles, both actual living witnesses to Jesus. They were chosen by him. They were brought into this group of leadership over the overall community of believers, and would later write out their account of what happened. The other 2 are not from apostles directly, but from cooperators with them. Mark is said to come from Simon Peter, who is the head of these apostles, the head of the head, as it were. Whereas Luke comes to us from Paul, who is one, though he becomes a later believer of Jesus, is also called an apostle. And we will go over that. We'll go over that in more detail next week as we talk about as we go over the data of the gospel. There's a lot of data to go over. So first, apostolic origin. These texts come from the apostles. Next, universal acceptance. That these texts are acknowledged by all Christian communities. As we get in later into the New Testament, we will see how Christian communities are settled across the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world. In many of the major cities, Alexandria in Egypt, Corinth, Thessalonica, Athens, Ephesus, Jerusalem, Rome. Many of these communities, themselves led by apostles or successors of the apostles, acknowledge these texts. And how they acknowledge it is the third point. They acknowledge it based on liturgical use. One of the ways to describe the ancient Christian worships, in many ways, the Christian worship of Catholics and Orthodox today, is calling it a liturgy. A Greek word that means a work of or for the people. Though Catholics usually call it the Mass, it can also be called a liturgy, sometimes the divine liturgy. This is the supreme worship of ancient Christians and even modern Christians. The ultimate worship service. These gospels that are accepted were a part of that worship service, a part of that liturgy. They are read aloud, announced, proclaimed at these liturgies. Not only that, but they are often commented upon by the leaders of these liturgical services. Homilies, sermons that come from this. Lastly, but very important, is that these Gospels have a consistent message. That while they are unique individual works, they're not all 100% the same. If they were literally the same, why would we have 4 of them? We'd only need 1, right? So though they have differences of what they say in and of itself, the overall message is consistent in and of itself with the rest of the Bible, and even with what the community of believers, the apostles, and what eventually becomes called the church, with what they bear witness to. So these 4 criteria are why we have not only really the Gospels that we have, but even any works of the New Testament overall. But in particular, looking at this from a gospel perspective, an evangelical perspective. So, why is Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, even if it's later, why is it not one of these 4 Gospels? The argument is made that it is of apostolic origin. It's named Thomas. Thomas is one of the 12 apostles. Now, there's argument, how can it be apostolic if it's written so late? So there's shaky ground already there. Universal acceptance. It was not accepted by every Christian community. In fact, the majority of them didn't do that. Liturgical use. There can be some ground for liturgical use. Some Christian communities used it in their worship. But the biggest strike is that its message is inconsistent with what has been announced and proclaimed. Not just in the other text, but the overall message that has been handed down through tradition. Refined in its more precise form in the scriptures. The Gospel of Thomas ultimately came from a group that separated itself from the main community and said they have a different or better message. Hence why the regular Christians, whether Catholic or Orthodox, or even later on Protestants, reject it and continue to reject it. It is inconsistent with everything else that's been announced. Its origin is of immense doubt. It's not universally accepted. So without those criteria, without fulfilling those criteria, it cannot be said to be a part of the canon of the New Testament. Excuse me. How do we know about these four Gospels, though? Or any of the texts of the New Testament? We know overall the, as it were, the canonicity of these four Gospels, of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from the witness of early Christians. Christians who lived in the first centuries after the life of Jesus, after even the life of the apostles. The earliest witnesses that we have date to around the year 100. Two individuals, Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp of Smyrna. Like I said, around the year 100, when they write various documents. And they cite specifically, word for word, from three of the four Gospels. From Matthew, from Luke, and from John. Not just in a way that, they kind of have something. No, literal text, literal quotations that make it clear they have read these documents and they know them and they use them and they trust them. Two of the earliest successors of the apostles, two of the earliest leaders in the Christian community that is the church. And both of them bear witness to that.
What was the other one besides Ignatius?
What's that?
What was the other one besides Ignatius?
Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp. Polycarp of Smyrna. Smyrna. I might have the Y and R backwards. I don't think so.
It said Polycarp
Polycarp, yes.
of.
Smyrna.
Okay.
Smyrna.
Thank you.
No problem. The next reference is an individual called Justin Martyr. Justin writes a little bit later, usually dated to about the 180s, 170s, 180s. Justin is not only a Christian, but he is a deep philosopher, a student of the various philosophers. And so he writes deep works talking about the faith, but also offering defenses of the Christian faith from non-Christians. He offers a document called the Apologia, or the defense, that he writes to the emperor at the time, trying to defend against false charges that were brought forth against Christians. Why? Because more often than not, they are still, at this time, a very small community, a very small percentage of the empire. They have grown from the apostolic roots, but they are still far much in the minority. They often act rather secretive. They don't allow others to participate in their rituals, in their worship. They are not the only ones, but They are also ones who reject the claim of worshiping the emperor as a demigod. Part of the maintenance of the empire was a tribute, a religious tribute to the empire, to the emperor, as a semi-divine figure. Christians always objected to that. And so Justin is writing a defense about what these Christians do. And as part of it, he describes the worship service that the Christians do. And he says, on the day of the sun, the first day of the week, according to the Roman calendar, they gather and they listen to various writings. And some of the references he makes are to that which he calls the memoirs of the apostles, which are called gospels. That's full phrase is what he writes. Memoirs of the apostles, which are called gospels, or called evangelii, he would write in Latin. And he cites at least 3 of them in some way, taking phrases from each one of those 3. There's argument about using all 4, but we'll see. We'll see why. There's some argument about that in the next section of class. Another witness is a man known as Papias. Who is said to have died around the year 160.
You said Papias?
Papias, Papias. It is Papias who talks about the oral tradition that precedes the Gospels and helps influence the writing of the Gospels. And he, in fact, even talks about who wrote 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark. He talks about Matthew being the apostle, Mark being a co-worker or a cooperator with Simon Peter. Another major writer of this time, Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus, Irenaeus, of the modern-day city of Lyon, Lyons. Irenaeus writes a work called the Adversus Heresiorum, Against the Heresies. That's dated to about 180 to 185 when it's composed. Irenaeus, in writing this work, he talks about these groups that have these fundamentally wrong ideas that come to be called heresies, hence why it's called Against the Heresies. And that many of these groups promote their own gospels. And he even references some of them. Among them, I believe, if I remember correctly, even references the Gospel of Thomas, calling it false. And talks about these 4 gospels as being what the Christian community, the right-believing Christian community, holds as truth. Lastly, not an individual, but a document. a document that has come to be called the Muratorian Canon. Then Muratorian. Canon, like we've been talking about in class. Not the one that can take your leg off. That we shot Evel Knievel out of trying to jump over the Grand Canyon. That is dated to about 170, and it is a document highlighting, what texts are worthy to be believed, what are canonical. And it lists these 4 Gospels as being canonical, as being worthy of the list. So there is immense witness outside of the New Testament itself as to why the New Testament is the way it is. Again, we must always understand this was not a book that was just magically put together and magically presented and laid in front of the community of Christian believers. Here you go, here's everything, all done. It took time and effort, work, diligence, and argument to discern and to say which books belong here and which do not.
Does that mean the other texts written by the apostles are not truths, or are they just partial truths?
They're a different type of drama. They're true as well. Are you talking about within the New Testament?
Just the texts written by the other apostles that weren't put into canon.
That does not necessarily mean they're untrue. There are documents from these first few centuries that are seen as being influential, but they're not considered revelation. That's the other part of it. Remember, revelation is the self-communication of God, so that we may know his deeds and his words. There are plenty of writings in the Christian tradition that are true, but they are not revelation. Everything in the Bible is revelation. So it's communicated by God through the agency of human beings, human authors. So we have other texts from close workers, such as Clement of Rome, such as the Shepherd of Hermas, letters that are attributed to Barnabas, one of the early cooperators with Paul. They are not untrue. I don't want to make it sound like everything outside the Bible is untrue. That's not what I mean. Some of these texts are. The Gospel of Thomas is untrue. Or it takes a small bit of truth and stretches it and applies this falsity to it to make it seem true. But what is in the New Testament is not just true, but it is, and as the phrase goes, it is the Word of God. So it is a far greater authority than just something merely written. It's just maybe a shopping list written by Paul or Peter. Those are apostolic writings, but they're not revelation. We don't have any of those yet. Be interesting. Paul was supposedly a tent maker. We'll talk about it when we get there more. Paul was supposedly a tent maker. So it'd be nice to use, fabrics, stakes, poles, rope, good rope.
The truth of fabrics.
Maybe. A good tent will get you a long way. In a second here, I think there was a comment or something. Oh, seems answered. Good. We being nearly 2,000 years removed from the actual events, and from even the process. It can be hard for us to understand, especially with the ease with which we make all of this happen, the ease with which we can put a book together and all of that. It's a lot more difficult in those days, just because of the resources available, the energy, the time, the work that needed to go into it. So this is a process that is not maybe as clear-cut or as easy as we may think in our minds, of getting the text that we have in front of us that we're going to begin to dive into very soon. So in all of these things, help us begin to understand these texts that we're going to be spending most of our time on the Gospels. These more ancient biographies detailing to us the life, the words, the works of Jesus of Nazareth. He who is the primary, the central figure in Christianity, whatever branch of it, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, whatever. Hence why these Gospels are the beginning of the New Testament. You can't dive into the rest of the New Testament without understanding the message of the Gospels. Hence why we will focus most of our energy and attention on them. Because it is the gospel that has shaped the Western world that we know of now. Many of the values, many of the ideas come from this text, these texts. Not just the New Testament, not just the Bible, but especially the gospel. Comments, questions, thoughts on any of that?
I was going to say, wasn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John some of his first followers?
Matthew and John are. That's why they're called apostles. They're not only some of his first believers, but they are also chosen to lead the community. And we'll talk about the apostles more. We'll talk about the followers, the believers of Jesus more as we dive into those texts.
Yeah, because I just read in the text that it was saying that they were the ones first chosen to spread the word and to deliver the word.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the group that's called the apostles are chosen. Mark and Luke are not initial believers in Jesus. They enter the community of believers later.
Okay.
So, but we'll talk about that more as we talk about the individual. We look over kind of the data of the Gospels, and also looking at those Gospels one by one.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? Anything else? So, we'll stop there and take a break.